Year 11, this brief video is feedback from the assessment that you've done recently, the interpretation questions regarding civil rights movement. This is actually from the 2018 paper, so this is a past paper. I actually think the interpretation is pretty kind. We've seen more difficult ones in previous years. What I'll do is I'll talk about them individually first and then go through each answer afterwards. So interpretation A is President Reagan in 83 when he's announcing Martin Luther King Day as an American national holiday. And the quotes that I'm going to be referring to are: King inspired our nation, he organised boycotts, rallies and marches, and his words that day will never be forgotten. Then interpretation B is Claiborne Carson, speaking in 2013, looking back on his life as a civil rights activist, in which he worked with many ordinary people involved in the movement. And then the four key quotes that I'm going to focus on here. My biggest impression was the ordinary people I met. I have always believed in the grassroots nature of the freedom struggle. People like Rosa Parks made it possible. And without King, the civil rights campaign would still have happened. So year 11. Question 1, how does B differ from A? You only need here to focus on content. And what I've done is I've noted what my answer would be rather than writing it out in full, which means that if you want to have a go at rewriting the answer using my notes, you can do. So, whereas A focuses on the role of Martin Luther King as a figurehead, B focuses more so on the role of ordinary people. That for me is the key difference. So whereas B focuses on ordinary people, A makes Martin Luther King the figurehead of the civil rights movement. So the quotes that I would use for A are inspired our nation and his words that day will never be forgotten, focusing on the role that the individual played. Whereas in B, I would focus on these two key quotes, that what struck the author was the ordinary people on the day, and that the author always believed in the grassroots nature of the freedom struggle, that the civil rights campaign was driven by ordinary people putting themselves at risk of harm and imprisonment, and the author's arguing that that is more important than the person leading them. Question 2, why might they differ? We need to look at provenance with a little bit of context thrown in. So for me, A is by President Reagan, who at the time was an actor in the 50s and 60s. He wasn't involved in the civil rights movement, and because of that, as from an outsider's perspective, he's more likely to focus on a figurehead as an exceptional black individual. And whereas with B, we've got a civil rights campaigner who has first-hand experience looking back at the movement. He spent his career working with those ordinary campaigners and wants to promote the efforts and the work that they did. So for me, it's all about perspective. Someone who was immersed in the movement versus someone from the outside looking in. And the knowledge that I would use to sort of back it up is that to sort of talk about the work of ordinary campaigners, there were roughly 250,000 people who were there at the March on Washington. Some estimates have it as higher. 75% of those people were black Americans. And another thing that I would mention for knowledge is that King's speech was televised. So for those who weren't there, that was all they saw of the day of the March on Washington. And it wasn't just in America, but internationally that King's speech was seen. So although clips from the March on Washington are rare, King's speech is internationally remembered. And then finally, question 3, which interpretation is more convincing? Now, you can have a decent bash at this answer just focusing on content and context, because it says explain your answer using the interpretations and your contextual knowledge, but sometimes there are relevant comments you can make about provenance too. Treat provenance as optional and context as the necessary. So we'll look at B first, because I think that B offers the more convincing interpretation. For me, because this is someone who's dedicated their career to highlighting the work of those protesters. But what I would argue about the statement being more convincing is this idea, this mention of Rosa Parks. People like Rosa Parks who made it possible for King to display his leadership. And that immediately made me think of the Montgomery bus boycott. Because The Montgomery bus boycott emerges from Rosa Parks' protest, her refusal to move on the bus in Alabama. And that is what inspires the boycott, and it is that boycott that sees King emerge as a civil rights leader in the state of Alabama. And so for me, what we've got is Rosa Parks, who inspired the boycott, which leads to King emerging. And so I think you've got a direct link with that example between that knowledge and that quote about people like Rosa Parks. Now, for me, why is A less convincing? Well, we've got a white politician who wasn't involved in the civil rights movement speaking on a day that the national holiday is announced, Martin Luther King Day, announcing it as an American national holiday. And so he's going to champion the role that Martin Luther King played as an individual. And I think the one quote that we could use knowledge to challenge is this quote about he organised boycotts, rallies and marches. Now, for me, I think we can challenge that. And the reason for that is Reagan is talking about the March on Washington, and he also mentions he organised boycotts, rallies and marches, and that is absolutely true. But the March on Washington, the event that Reagan talks about, was not organised by Martin Luther King. It was organised by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, and they worked with many civil rights groups. And the official name of the march was for jobs and freedom. Martin Luther King was just a speaker on that day in 1963. He did not organise the March on Washington. So even though Reagan's right when he talks about King organising boycotts, rallies and marches, the event in question, King was just a speaker on that day. And that's, for me, how we can use the content to say that it's less convincing than B. Okay, Year 11, what now? What can you do to make listening to this video as useful as possible? My advice is to get your answers out and to annotate them. Figure out where marks were awarded, where marks were lost, and you can annotate those answers to figure out how you can improve those answers in future. If you feel that you could do a much better attempt at one or more of them, I'd have another go at doing it, redo it, and use my audio description and the notes that I've created to help you write another version of the answer. I think that would be very useful as preparation for the summer.